Good afternoon, everybody. We are here for the second installment of Chapter 20, going through the Industrial Revolution in Europe, and more specifically Great Britain. We're going to talk about really how the Industrial Revolution transformed the continent technologically, socially, politically, and intellectually. On the left there, on the top, you see the Trevithick steam engine locomotive. So believe it or not, that was the first prototype of a train. And that just kind of shows you how fast things got. So you see how quickly things rise to prominence and to progress. The other thing that you see on this page is the urbanization of Europe, as the number of large cities grew from 1800 to 1900. Specifically in Great Britain, there you see the number of cities, of over 100,000 equaled that of Europe. But all across Europe, you see tremendous urbanization, and even in particular in the Germanic area, the German Confederation. So part of what drove this is this concept of a free market and free trade. There's this concept of the classical liberal. So you have Ricardo and Adam Smith and Thomas Malthus, who are good examples of classical liberals. And the term actually means something different. The term liberal actually means something different than it does today. Liberals were actually people who encouraged more of a free market, less unions, less less restrictions, and kind of less support to protect workers, and more advancement of the free market and the free trade concept, so that by the time the Industrial Revolution took hold. Britain, for instance, was moving towards a completely an economy that was completely based on free trade, and there wasn't any concept of how much things cost to export or to import, and there wasn't a whole lot of conversation around protecting the worker. So it was more kind of a laissez-faire concept. Because of this, you have these different theories that developed. We talked about this a little bit in class, but the iron law of wages, Ricardo's concept that wages would always be at the level of subsistence, meaning that regardless of what you said as kind of like higher wages or a minimum wage or whatever, they would always rise only to the level that people could only survive on, because of the number of people that existed. You just couldn't pay people more than that, because it would essentially bankrupt the system. So and then again, this concept of urbanization, people living in these big cities because they were close to the factories, which drove the population growth. And as we talked about a little bit in class, changed that family structure where you have more defined roles for men and women. Children, sometimes they're working, sometimes they're not. You see that kind of rise to an important aspect of society during this time, because of the need for people to work, and but also because of the number of people that were the number of children that were being born, that really did create more defined gender roles for men and women. In Europe, you had these separate spheres where women would be in the home, and men would be in the factories. And it wasn't that the women weren't working, but their home was where they worked, because that's the only way that people could afford it. You had an obvious increase in technology and technological advancement during this time. That spread across the globe, really. You had things like, obviously, the steam engine, but then by the end of the century, by the end of the 18th century, you're talking about the telegraph and eventually the telephone, and then into the 1900s. So you have a tremendous amount of technological advancement in these 100 years. So there was just a lot of transformation around that. Work time drastically increased. We talked a little bit about that, but just in terms of how much people worked. In 1830, for instance, people worked 50 more days a year than they did in 1760. So in 70 years, people were working 50 more days a year. So we often think about how kind of like the mechanization of society helps people work less. In actuality, they work more. And that's a question that you have to ask yourself. With the digital age that we live in and robotics and things like that, are people actually working less or are they working more? Um, it's an interesting philosophical question and debate there. But there was a massive increase in time that people working, um, and there was also an increase in the time of day that people worked. So there were people that pushed back on that. The Tory Party, which is a conservative party in Great Britain, pushed back on attempts to push this free market, push this capitalist mentality. But at the end of the day, at least between 1800 and 1850, their efforts were met with little success. So that leads to a conversation around the effects of the industrialization. So you have just poor working conditions. There you see an image of people working in mines. Terrible conditions in the mines actually affected the the life expectancy. You had poor working conditions for children, the abuse of children that we talked about in class, of long hours, and again, just not a lot of them learning things that they would be able to use. There you see that the other point there, tremendous population growth. In 80 years, the population of Europe doubled, which helped to drive this industrial boom, but it also gave a tremendous amount of population support to conditions that weren't the best for people. You had again, you see the chart there below. Things didn't get better in terms of working conditions. These were causes of death in mines, from 1838 to 1864. Obviously you see the numbers increase in almost every area. The drowning decreased because of that steam engine technological advancement, so that they had less water in the mines, and better technology to for people falling down shafts, but just not safe conditions in the mines. And in factories, you had again just cramped spaces, poor ventilation. In some cases, the machinery was dangerous to work with. So it just wasn't great at all. That didn't stop people from wanting to find jobs though. And for instance, an increased immigration to England. The Irish who didn't have jobs and needed sources of income, they immigrated to England, as kind of this place of opportunity. You had this increase of this certain class of factory owners who were more of a middle class, more of a bourgeoisie, because of the amount of wealth that existed in places like Great Britain. We talked about the consequences of the gender roles and the separate spheres. There was pushback by some. Robert Owen is a great example of that. Robert Owen of New Harmony, Indiana fame, if you remember that name from perhaps AP U.S. history or U.S. history, he moved to the United States and basically started a community in New Harmony, Indiana. It was a socialist community. Before he did that, though, he was a factory owner that advocated for children's rights, education, rights of workers, appropriate conditions for people, so that it definitely he was one of the few, but there definitely were people who were looking out for for the people. But in general, just poor working conditions, long hours, And part of the reason why this existed was there was such an unequal distribution of wealth, similar to today. In many places, you had the richest 1% that controlled 25 to 35% of the gross national product in places like Great Britain. So um, you know, the top 1 to 2% just had so much of the wealth. Eventually, this trickled down, but it really didn't happen until post 1850, 1860. Um, just to break it up here, this is a picture of my dog eating ice cream on the eastern shore of Maryland this summer. Boy does love ice cream, and he looks kind of dopey there because it's about 112 degrees, and he was really enjoying that ice cream. In the background, you see my daughter, who um, somehow defies the laws of physics and was able to slowly eat that cup of ice cream for about 25 minutes and not have it melt. Just tremendous enjoyment there. So anyway, break up the monotony of this video. So the response to this, in addition to people like Robert Owen, you have the government in some cases trying to enforce things like lack of unions, and that was the Combination Acts were a great example of this. The English government, the English Parliament actually passed laws against unions, but these were widely disregarded and basically ignored. People could, decided to get together and go against the conditions that were so harmful to workers. You did have, romantic poets, romantic authors. William Blake, William Wordsworth were two great examples who kind of just wrote about the experience of of people living in this time, to comment on and to make note of the poor conditions. Couple of the groups that arose during this time. One were the Luddites. The Luddites, and there you see a picture of a couple of Luddites taking some hammers, some sledgehammers to this machinery. The Luddites were a group that was a very kind of secret group. They didn't go by names. They went by numbers. They wore masks, and they would go around in Great Britain and smash factory equipment, so that it would affect the ability to produce things, and basically would go against the treatment of these workers. And it also was a commentary on how the cottage system was being replaced by these machines, and people who had worked in their homes, who would produce things, textiles and other things. They didn't want to work in these factories because it was boring, it was monotonous, it was just kind of the early notion of an assembly line. So they were a big supporters and involved with the Luddites. Another group that protested against this kind of thing and more took a political role were the Chartists. There you see the 6 points of the People's Charter. The biggest thing that the Chartists want were universal male suffrage, to basically use politics to rail against and to prevent the poor treatment of people during the Industrial Revolution. And they're actually five of the six points in the People's Charter here actually happened across Europe. So they were actually the first example of almost like a political action group or a political protest group, and eventually they did make some gains. They gave millions of men and women a sense of working class consciousness. So they're a great example of this understanding of what it means to be conscious of what class they are in. They worked hard to get that, to demand universal male suffrage. Got national petitions through England or through Great Britain, but they were eventually rejected by Parliament. But the ideas never died, and they kind of traveled through Europe, and to a point, you do have some some improvements. You have the Factory Acts of 1833 and the Mines Act of 1842. Both were aimed at helping children, but definitely helped work environments, all the way through in terms of whether it was children or adults. So this is just a little bit of what the Industrial Revolution meant to Europe. Tremendous urban growth. Tremendous growth of the middle class and giving wages to lower classes. I talked a lot about kind of the negatives, but there were a lot of positives that arose. People had access to cheaper goods. People had access to more income, and it did, as I said, define a lot of social aspects of Europe, and really supplanted capitalism as the main economic system of Europe at the time. So lots going on in this time period between 1780 and 1850 that is going to kind of springboard us to the second half of the century, more revolutions and more modernization. So that's it.